Submission is a dirty word these days. To submit is to be oppressed or abused. Women of this day particularly are prone to believe that they must never submit to their husbands, as scriptures clearly encourage them to do. But men are not immune to it either, particularly in the workplace. We cringe at the thought of having a boss who has authority over us. And children are taught all about their rights in school before they're ever taught about humility or honoring authority. They say things to teachers today that I could not imagine having said. First, because in my time I might have gotten backhanded by the teacher. But second, because whatever the teacher did to me, it would have been way worse for me at home. Today, however, not only are teachers prevented from physical discipline, but parents are sometimes prevented from any kind of physical discipline. Their kids call the police on them, and the parents are taken to jail for domestic violence. Obviously, all of this came about because of sin. Men were sinful and abused their wives until women would no longer submit. Some teachers were abusive and bullied children and bullied students until students would not submit and rebelled. Bosses were sinful and abused their authority until employees rose up and revolted. Where do you think unions came from? Parents were sinful and used harsh physical discipline because it was just easier to hit the kid than to sit down and have to talk to him. But all of that being true still does not make submission a dirty word. In fact, Jesus Christ himself submitted. We see it in the gospel for today. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. You got to feel bad for Mary and Joseph. They did not understand what it was like to be the parents of God. No one had ever done that one before, by the way. And we get a glimpse of what it must have been like for them in this text that we have today. Mary and Joseph and Jesus gone off to Jerusalem for Passover celebration, right? After the festival, Jesus went to his father's house, to the temple, to discuss important matters with religious leaders. A little unusual for 12-year-old boys, but Jesus being Jesus. So Mary and Joseph, forgetting that Jesus was Jesus, thought that he was playing with his cousins somewhere, and they started the caravan back to Nazareth. Well, you know how it is with large family gatherings. Everyone assumes that some adult is watching the kids, and the kids are all playing together anyway somewhere, except Jesus wasn't your usual kid. But in the end, notice that regardless of the fact that his parents were dead wrong and that Jesus was completely right, he was submissive to them because they were his parents. And that's what the fourth commandment calls for, period. People in today's world would scream foul. How unfair it was for poor little Jesus to get in trouble. He has rights. See, somehow we have decided as a culture that submission is only called for when the person who is in authority is absolutely right. But that's not what the fourth commandment says. God says through Moses, honor your father and your mother that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God has given you. Through St. Paul, God says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. See, it doesn't say anything about being right. It says submission is based on who they are, not whether or not they're right. Submission is a holy thing. Submission is our ability to proclaim our thanks before God for the people he has placed in our lives to help take care of us. By honoring and submitting to the people that God has given us, we are honoring and submitting to God. Bishop Hardy and I served as vice presidents together before he was elected and elevated to bishop. After his election, he once looked at me one evening and he said, "You know, we're peers. You don't have to call me bishop." And I told him, "I do not call you bishop for you. I call you bishop for me. Because calling you bishop reminds me every time I use that word that God has placed you in authority over me to help me, to protect me, to bless me. I submit to Bishop Hardy's authority because submitting to his authority is the same as submitting to God's authority. It is God who places authority in our lives." Yes, you know what? Sometimes there are bad bishops, and pastors struggle to submit under them because maybe they're lazy, or maybe they're abusive, or maybe they're heretical. That does not make submission bad. It makes submission difficult. Likewise in marriage, some husbands that are placed in authority abandon their posts or misuse their authority, and their wives have no choice but to step up to fill the void. Some men fail to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Some fathers intentionally exasperate their children. But human failure does not make submission bad, just more difficult. I am absolutely certain that it was often challenging for Jesus on a human level to submit to Mary and Joseph. I mean, imagine just for a second being the all-powerful, all-knowing God and having a human being tell you that you were naughty for being in the temple instead of playing mumbly peg with your cousins. Nevertheless, Jesus submitted because it was the right thing to do. And later on, Jesus' submission would be far greater. St. Paul tells us, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Being obedient to Mary and Joseph might have been a challenge from time to time, but it was nothing compared to being obedient to the point of death on a cross. But that's what he did. And he did it so that you and I could be forgiven of all of our disobedience, all of our lack of submission, for all the times we have placed ourselves and our pride above God. For all of that, he was obedient to the point of death on a cross. And because he submitted, we inherit eternal life. Because he submitted, we have been adopted through holy baptism. We are fed with his very body and blood so that he lives within us. We receive all the benefits of his submission. And see, it turns out that submission is a good word. It's a beautiful word.